Welcome to this episode of Timotheus Academy. This episode is part one of a multi-part Timotheus Academy episode that will feature content that I believe will be of great value to you, as it will feature a recent discussion that took place between myself and a dear friend of mine, Dr. Richard Howe. My discussion with Dr. Howe was quite extensive, yet we were only able to briefly touch on the topics I wanted to discuss with him. I hope he will return for future Timotheus Academy episodes so that I can speak to him further. But in the discussion that we had, Dr. Howe and I discussed very important topics, including the topic of what is philosophy and what is philosophy able to do. Both of these are featured here for you in part one of this multi-part Timotheus Academy episode. Please understand that at Timotheus Academy, we are committed to having a very high production value for our content. And there was a technical issue that might have been overlooked by others during the recording of the original discussion. So then, to ensure that you have a listening experience free of distraction, it was necessary to re-record my audio after the interview took place. Since then, I was able to re-record my audio with the entire discussion already known to me. The wording of my questions in this podcast is slightly different than the wording of the questions that were posed in the original discussion that was recorded. But this difference should only serve to improve the listening experience. But I do not believe that the meaning of the questions was changed in any real material way. So without further delay, I have had the honor of knowing Richard for some time. He was instrumental in my going to pursue PhD studies at Southern Evangelical Seminary. He was my program director and professor while I was a student there. And when I began to teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary, I was honored to count him as a friend and colleague. Richard is remarkably well-read, able to speak very deeply about an incredible number of topics, and one of the funniest people I know. I have had the privilege of conversing with Richard over many cups of coffee and several meals at restaurants, and I always leave our conversations encouraged and better equipped and more knowledgeable about a host of topics. For some time, I have wanted to have Richard come on the Timotheus Academy podcast, and now that has happened. And I believe you will benefit from my discussion with Richard here on this podcast, as I have always benefited from speaking with him. And so as we begin here today, Richard, would you please take a moment and speak to our audience about yourself, giving them a little bit of background so that they can know you better?
I wasn't raised in the church, but I got saved when I was 16 years old through influences and friends of mine in high school. Never really had any religious training as a child, but God began to deal with me as a teenager, and I came to trust Christ once I understood my need and such through the Holy Spirit. I got saved 16, but and went off to college and studied music. I was a percussionist and decided to make that my major, and had the opportunity to study the Bible as a major at one of our denominational flagship, the flagship college of our denomination that I was, and this was back in Mississippi, and I lost my faith in college. Now, the college campus was a great nurturing environment for the Christian walk, except the religion department. It was fraught with theological liberalism and skepticism, JEPD, higher criticism, Jesus versus Paul studies, these kinds of things. And one might think, well, what does that have to do with the topic of philosophy? I think what we'll discover is a lot of the bedrock corruption, if you will, or cracks in the foundation that give rise to some of these skeptical views about the Christian faith or the scriptures in particular, or things like that. They're philosophical. And they're not exclusively that, of course, but they involve philosophical things. So having gotten restored in my walk with the Lord through apologetics, and came under the tutelage of Norm Geisler as a Dallas Seminary student, and he encouraged me to pursue philosophy. At the time, there wasn't a lot of options to study apologetics in seminaries, but he had some good ideas about where I could do academic philosophy, so that's what I did. Ended up going back to my home state of Mississippi and did an MA in philosophy at Ole Miss, and then took a little hiatus there, and then ended up doing a doctorate. Did some postgraduate work at Marquette University, but ended up at University of Arkansas to finish the PhD in philosophy. So both of I kind of like the fact that both of my degrees in philosophy are from, if I may use the term, secular universities, right? State universities would probably be a sufficient term, but internationally, sometimes a person in another country might not understand the implications of saying that you went to a state university. It might not mean a whole lot. But if you say secular to your Christian friends, they kind of get an idea. Okay, in other words, it wasn't necessarily Christian, and it wasn't necessarily Christian. But not to jump ahead, but a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of your people you've taught them this, would be surprised how many Christians there actually are in academic philosophy in the United States. So while it's not going to church and it's not Sunday school, you find a lot of things that it finds a comfortable place at the table in terms of the conversation. One among many ideas. So the Lord has really given me such a privilege to be able to study academic philosophy and then come back and do apologetics with that undergirding.
I appreciate the wonderful segue that you have provided for me already. I heard you mention philosophy when you were speaking about your background and some of the matters that you have studied deeply. And I wonder if you would take a moment and maybe expound on what philosophy is. There does seem to be some confusion about this question, as some might even propose that philosophy just means how they live their life, or a particular method they have developed for living their life. Like someone might say, my philosophy is waking up early and having a good breakfast and getting to work, or something like that. Again, some people simply use philosophy to refer to how they have discovered they should live their life, or how they... Again, some people simply use the word philosophy to... Again, some people seem to simply use the word philosophy to refer to how they choose to live their life. But obviously that isn't what we're talking about when we talk about philosophy here today. But perhaps you could just take a moment and expound for our listeners what we are talking about as we discuss philosophy.
Yeah, of course. I think students of philosophy over the years have discovered that it's a lot easier to become aware of what it is, having done it for a little bit at least, and then look back on. But it almost never is easy to give a succinct definition. But I like what Ed Miller was at University of Colorado Boulder. I think he was a Christian. He was basically the philosopher there. And I used his textbook called Questions That Matter when I was a graduate student at Ole Miss. And a lot, people may or may not know that oftentimes, if you're working on a graduate or a doctorate, that you can teach courses, say at the undergraduate level in your area, and that's sort of like a financial aid kind of package. You get your tuition waiver, and you get a stipend, and it really is helpful to kind of be trying to teach this stuff at a couple of steps down from what you're learning. That's a good experience to try to see how to shoehorn it into somebody who's not in a graduate level or a doctoral level. And so Ed Miller basically defines philosophy as thinking rationally and critically about life's most important questions. And then he unpacks each of those words. Rationally would be in opposition to, say, an undue emotion, where we know a lot, especially as Americans, we know how much emotions can drive the narrative and the debate, especially in politics. People get passionate about their views, and sometimes emotions can run roughshod over sound principles of reason and logic and evidence and things like that. So philosophy's want to be rational, and of course that's not unique to philosophy. Any academic discipline would want to be rational. You're not going to do medicine and then be contradictory or indifferent to the evidence and the arguments about a particular medical procedure. So, of course, that's not unique. And then critically, and that word's kind of fallen into disrepute with critical theory and critical race theory, these kind of things. And we even in English, don't we use it almost as a bad thing. Well, he's a very critical person, right? Meaning you're always finding what's wrong with everybody, and you're always voicing your opinions about what's wrong with everything around you and stuff. But in this context, critical just means subjecting something to a legitimate critique. That is to say, there are things that we cherish as human beings. We'll get into some of those that sometimes warrant a certain level of critique as to whether our orientations regarding those things is actually on track and actually true or not. And so, being willing to do that it kind of falls under the purview. Now, there's one caveat to all this. I think you and I are in solidarity on this, but most philosophers with whom I'm familiar, I shouldn't say most, many with whom I'm familiar, wouldn't be so sympathetic to our opinions. And that's this, that there had been a tendency, especially rising in the 20th century, to relegate philosophy as just a sort of a housekeeping discipline. It's just a way other disciplines learn how to manage their glossaries and their borders and their categories and their logic and the way they do whatever they're doing, physics or chemistry or history, whatever. But the philosopher himself, according to this view, didn't really have any content to bring to the table. He's just more or less the housekeeper of it, what they call a second order discipline. It just deals with other disciplines. But in the classical tradition that we celebrate at Southern Evangelical Seminary, meaning this tradition arising out of the ancient Greeks, imbibed by the church fathers, guiding theological thinking and development through the history of the Western Christianity, certainly, finding its zenith in the Middle Ages. That tradition says there are actual truths about reality that the philosopher is uniquely equipped to address. And so what I think we'll discover in our conversation is some of those truths spill over into everything else that we think and do as human beings, everything. So that in a sense, the philosopher ends up being at a very critical point of critique, if you will, because so many different things we do and say as humans involves the categories, methods, data points, content, whatever, of philosophy.
It seems the notion has arisen that while philosophy may have some air of nobility about it, it can't do anything. Philosophy can't warm up our food. And so then philosophy seems to almost be relegated to an inferior position, while other sciences and disciplines that can do things in people's mind enjoy a more prominent position.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, especially with the positivists in the early 20th century, the H.A. Ayers and these thinkers. Yeah, it wasn't it was less a practical thing. And a lot of these distinctions that we are used to today when we have these conversations, academic distinctions even, are fairly modern. In the ancient Greeks, it was just knowledge. You just knew things, right? So you could study. So Aristotle could write about on the parts of animals, and then he could write about physics, and then he could write about metaphysics, and then ethics. And while the certain tools used to assail the questions in each of those disciplines might vary depending on the kind of thing you're talking about, they were all just elements of reality. And that's what a learned man. In fact, the word philosopher was often used in ancient usage as an educated or learned person because they just kind of knew stuff around them. Now it's gotten very narrow, and as recent as the Middle Ages, questions that would concern what we would call the natural sciences, like physics or biology, and questions that we would label as philosophy, those questions were a lot closer connected. But today you go to a college campus in the United States, you can't even see the philosophy department if you're standing in the physics department. They just don't have anything to do with each other because they don't warm your meal, like you say. They don't do a lot of things that seem to be immediately practical.
There also seems to almost be the opposite taking place. Instead of some people relegating philosophy to an inferior position, they almost have anxiety about philosophy, given some assumption that philosophy is not understood, or is dangerous, or is so strong that it can do something that they might not expect or anticipate. And so perhaps because someone doesn't understand what philosophy is, they come to the conclusion that there's something dangerous to philosophy and unwise about using it at all.
Well, I did find a lot of interesting reactions when I began a graduate degree in philosophy. I didn't do undergraduate degree in philosophy. I had some philosophy courses, but I only got into the graduate program on a probationary status to kind of had to prove that I could do it, at least sufficiently to their satisfaction. And rightly or wrongly, they decided I did have what I needed. But it was interesting reactions that you get from people when you tell them at that time working on a philosophy degree, because some people, they didn't know what that was. They weren't sure that that wasn't the same thing as psychology, because they both started with a P that isn't pronounced. you know, uh, uh, and so some people were just kind of not sure. My Christian friends then began to get a little suspicious because they thought, "No, I'm not, yeah, like you're saying, sort of kind of like can lead you astray." And some were just flat out hostile. I mean, you see people like John MacArthur and his article that he wrote in the 70s and then revisited in 2019, and actually has a lecture from the 70s on it, supposedly exegeting Colossians 2:8. Oh no, philosophy is philosophy or Christ. That was the name of one of his articles. And such. So you run this spectrum of people's, they don't know what it is, or they're kind of weary of it, not weary, but wary of it. Certainly that, and there's a mix, but outright suspicion. So that now there's a contingent of contemporary evangelicals who really eschew rigorous dealing in philosophical issues, or even worse, what they eschew is bringing philosophy to the table to try to use philosophy to inform us. They think, no, this is an intrusion on our theology, for example. And I don't think that's going on, but we'll see after we get done here today whether we're right about that or not.
And so, returning to that question about what philosophy can do, we understand that this is really the wrong question in many senses, as the question of utility and practicality isn't really getting at the importance of something. In other words, something's ability to do something, or its utility or practicality, doesn't determine that thing's value at all. However, if we just accept the premise of the question that someone might ask when they ask, "What can philosophy do?" and our response is not, "Well, that's the wrong question entirely," we can point out, right, that philosophy is able to do very important things, critically important things. And there may be some sense that philosophy is only able to do some of these things. And in some sense, philosophy may only be able to do some of these things. Could you please expound on this matter for our listeners?
Yes, yes. And to your point about, when people are kind of locked in this, what utility does it have? What practicality does it have? If someone doesn't know what a car engine is, they know what a car is, and they drive their car to work and to the grocery store or whatever. But if they don't know what a car is, and you just pulled out a push rod or a rocker arm and just said, "What good is this?" They'd probably go, "I don't know. I mean, it just looks like a piece of metal that I can't imagine what it could do. Maybe a good paperweight or something," because they don't see how it fits into a bigger context, which ultimately is eminently practical, right? So I think there's a sense in which philosophy do that. So, for example, probably the most critical one that we could put our finger on is the whole issue of what is truth. Because as Christians, we say, well, we believe the Bible is true, we believe Christianity is true, and I'm old enough to remember a time in the U.S., and I keep making these international references because the internet, I mean, we got a lot of viewers, don't we, all over the world, and it may not be exactly the same in some other countries, but in the U.S., I'm old enough to remember a time where if you said to someone, well, I believe the Bible is true, they knew what you meant, even if they didn't agree with you. They would say, well, I don't believe it is true. I don't believe, I don't. They would know what everybody meant by the categories. Today, you can't bank on the fact that someone's even going to know what you mean. So when you say to some people, I believe the Bible is true, that will sound to them like, I think asparagus tastes good. And they're happy for you if you like asparagus. They might like another vegetable more. They might not like asparagus, but they would never feel compelled to disabuse you of your affection for your asparagus, right? That's true for you and not for me, kind of stuff. And you go, okay, well, lots of things are true for one and not for another in terms of does asparagus taste good? That's true for me. Does Brussels sprouts, do they taste good? That's not true for me, right? So philosophy then has, if you just go, okay, so what are we saying about something when we say that it's true? Well, whatever that is, that's a philosophical conversation from that point forward. When I say, well, the question of what is truth is a philosophical question, it doesn't make sense for someone to protest. Like a Richard Dawkins, for example, might be one who would protest and try to say, no, in fact, he does do this with the question of God's existence. Whether God exists or not is strictly a scientific question. And I just go, but that's like saying hunting for seashells on the seashore is strictly a metal detector question. That's what he's doing. He's got a metal detector on the beach looking for seashells and doesn't realize his equipment is ill conceived to detect calcium carbonate. It only detects metal. So by parallel, there are certain, as we said, content, we would argue content, certainly methods, protocols, and logic and such that is integral to the philosophical undertaking, that is essential to deal with certain questions that when you try to force it into a different kind of question, you're doing violence to the very reality you're trying to understand. You can't understand seashells with a metal detector. You have to have some other means of understanding. When it comes to these questions like truth that we've already brought up and the existence of God, there are certain elements of the discipline of philosophy that we give the name philosophy to doing those particular elements and methods and stuff. That's why we call it philosophy. So truth is one. Another one that is, I think, at the heart of really the task that we have before us as Christians for the Great Commission, spreading the gospel, is the distinctions, if there are any, and I think there are, between faith and reason. You know, it's interesting. Robert Riley wrote a book called The Closing of the Muslim Mind, taking a cue from Alan Bloom's book back in the 80s, I think, The Closing of the American Mind. What Riley discovered in his research was, with respect to Sunni Islam, about 80%. He did this research into how contrast Christianity versus Islam grappled with the question of what is the relationship of faith and reason. And by and large, medieval Christianity came to a view that, and reason, by the way, would involve what we're talking about, philosophy. I mean, it'll involve other things too, but it'll include that. And Christianity more or less settled with this relationship that's mutually beneficial between the truths that we know that are theological, that we know from revealed truth from the scriptures as a Christian, and then the truths we can know by reason. And then Christians more or less settle for a healthy relationship. And without the details, I think you can show that really opened Christian Europe, especially, to new ideas in diplomatic relations versus, it used to be to grow as a country, you conquer your neighbor and you take their stuff. That's how you develop your nation. But Christian Europe began to have barriers along language or even geography, like mountain ranges, and then have peaceful coexistence through diplomatic relations and try to come and things like that. They were open to that. They were open to new ideas in economics, moving from feudal to a more marketplace and private property rights. They were open to new ideas in the natural sciences, moving from the old Ptolemaic geocentrism, where the Earth is the center of the solar system and all the heavenly bodies revolve around it, to the sun is the center of the solar system and our elements of the solar system revolve around it. We're open to that. I mean, sometimes these things were hard to swallow, and it might have taken centuries to eventually make the transition. But the point is, Christians were open to the viability of reason as a way of understanding God's creation. In contrast, what Riley argues is that Sunni Islam was the opposite, and they subjugated reason to the word of Allah, and you don't ask questions, and you just, if Allah says that 2 + 2 is 5, then it's 5, and you don't challenge that. And he argues it arrested medieval Islam in their cultural development, because there was a time where they were on the vanguard of cultural development across Europe, but they got arrested. So today you still have Muslim nations who think their relationship with other nations should fall along the contours of conquer those nations, install Sharia law, and bring everybody into subjection to the word of Allah and the Quran, right? So you just go, wow, all of that, the modern Islamic crisis is the point of his book, is all a residual fallout from mishandling the relationship of faith and reason. You just go, whoa, okay, now you talk about, can that warm your plate? This keeps your plate from maybe getting stolen or blown up in a terrorist attack in principle, because you're able to deal with these kind of issues. They're long-term in that case, because it wasn't like everybody just started, well, they're long-term. It wasn't like the Christians just immediately adapted everything that we celebrate now in developed nations, but nevertheless, it's there. So you got truth, you got faith and reason. And you can stop me when you want. I mean, I got a whole list of them here. We can talk about as many as you want. We've mentioned Richard Dawkins already. Dawkins is of the mindset, as many of these scientists are, at least in my experience, many of them are, that science and the methods of science are the only tool we need to understand reality. What people disparagingly refer to as a scientism. Now, they don't use that term for themselves, but we disparagingly refer to it, because it's the idea that if Peter Atkins, by the way, is another example. If any of your viewers have seen the debate that he did with William Lane Craig back in the late 90s, Peter Atkins at the time had written what is the most widely used textbook in chemistry in Anglo-American universities. So he's no small scientist. And he makes that statement that anything, can be interpreted along the contours or the lines of the natural sciences, everything. Well, of course, that in so many words rules out a priori, before you even start the investigation, it already rules out God, since you don't see God. He's not something you can stick a litmus paper in and see if it turns pink or blue, right? You can't do that with God. You can't do that with morality. You can't do that with logic even. In fact, there's a Kodak moment, as people from my generation would say. So Kodak was this famous camera company, and a Kodak moment was something, boy, you want to catch it on a picture. There was a Kodak moment in the debate when Atkins actually asked Bill Craig, well, what do you think, science can't do? Like, tell me what you think it can't do. Oops, man, he just opened himself up, and Craig just went down this bullet list in like 90 seconds. And science can't do this. And one of them was, science can't even justify itself. It can't, because it can't justify logic and reason, because it needs logic and reason to even be science in the first place. So I'm laughing because this idea that science is all you need to understand truths about reality is demonstrably self-refuting. Because that statement itself is a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement. And then you think about things about, we mentioned the existence of God, and if there is a God or not, that's a philosophical question. What are God's attributes? That's philosophical. And by the way, just to remind your viewers, by saying something is philosophical, I don't mean it's exclusively philosophical, that it's only that. I'm just saying, because we're trying to counter almost a century of people that kept saying we don't have anything to say about anything. We're trying to muscle our way back to the table and go, no, we've got some things to say. We're not trying to say we're the only member of the conversation. Like God, because obviously the scriptures tell us things about God we couldn't know by reason. But it also has things to do about God's existence and attributes and stuff. Then you got issues of morality and such. When you in the Declaration of Independence, our birth certificate as Americans, and it's not a legal document, but it kind of is an insight into the milieu under which the Constitution was forged. And when I'm not going to recite it, I have it memorized, that sort of preamble, but to spare your viewers, But when they're trying basically to say, hey, if you're going to sever yourself from another country and start a new country, you better give some good reasons. You better be ready to tell your fellow human why you're doing this. And so they say they start to iterate these self-evident truths. Well, between those two, hey, you better give good reasons, and then start saying, here's all the things we want that are self-evident. They use a phrase that says the reason why we think we can do this, split off from King George and the colonies become an independent nation, is because these we have unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that arise from nature and nature's God. Now, nature there, we tend to think nature largely in terms of the physics of things, chemistry and physics and that kind of stuff. And that's obviously part of nature. But in 18th century English, as residual from earlier thinking from the Middle Ages all the way back to the Greeks, ancient Greeks, this idea of nature also would include moral truths that are knowable by reason, that are self-evident truths. I would submit to your audience that this is what Paul is getting at in a number of places, not the least of which is Romans 2:14 and 15, when it talks about the works of the law are written on the heart. And Thomas Aquinas would argue that human beings' ability to some extent, not flawless, but human beings' ability to some extent to know moral truths is a means by which God manages nations in the earth. And maybe the last thing, just to kind of full circle here, and we can think of them more as we go along if you want, is something that might strike people as almost entirely a theological concern. It happens to be one that I'm very concerned about, as I'm sure you are as well, and a lot of your audience probably is as well, and that's the inerrancy of the Bible, the inerrancy. And you go, well, what is that? Well, obviously, inerrancy is going to presuppose that there is truth, because if there wasn't a such thing as truth, there wouldn't be a such thing as error, right? So at least that, as we started out with, but even more since I don't know when, philosophers, who, by the way, can sometimes be the problem and not the solution. Sometimes the very solutions that we appeal to philosophy to solve are problems that were created by the philosopher. And an example of those would be other, quote, theories of truth, where something's true because it works in my life. So it's pragmatism. Or something is true because it's consistent with other truths that we already embrace. Or something is true because it yields political power, as we see a lot in the identity politics and stuff, that arguments about truth are merely arguments about political power. One of the ones that's plagued the question of inerrancy is sometimes called an intentionalist view of truth or a functional view of truth. And that is, well, something is true if it fulfills the intention that the writer had. And the example I give, if I may take a second for that, suppose somebody at church said, well, hey, suppose somebody's visiting your church. And so you're, hey, good to have you and stuff. And afterwards say, hey, a bunch of us are going out to so-and-so restaurant. You'd love for you to, join us. Okay, how do I get there? Now, here's what the guy says. Okay, here's how you get there. When you pull out of the church parking lot, you take a right, you go up to the T-bone, take another right, you go a few miles, you'll see a Walmart on your right, and right down beyond the Walmart is so-and-so restaurant. Okay, guy gets in his car, takes a right out of the church, goes down to the T-bone, takes a right, starts going down a couple of miles. Well, actually, the Walmart's on his left. It's not on the right. It's on the left, but he sees so-and-so restaurant. So he still made it to the restaurant. So the guy probably wouldn't go, okay, well, I'm not even going. That's probably not the restaurant. The guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a lie. You'd go, you know what? This is an incidental error. It doesn't erase his intention to get me there. So people will do that with the Bible. And they'll say, well, the purpose of the Bible is to get us to heaven. So if Jesus gets the mustard seed wrong, it's not that big a deal. If John, or rather Matthew, gets one of the names wrong in the genealogy, it's not that big a deal. Or if John wants to change the day of the week of the crucifixion to make a theological point. It's not that big a deal because as long as it gets us to heaven, that was his purpose. And so, and I would go without argument here because I know we're not here to talk about inerrancy, but just to see the tie-in is to say, well, if you allow these errors, Matthew's got a name wrong, John changed the facts, Jesus didn't know what a mustard seed was or didn't know how big they were. If you let that, then what that I think proves, shown by the little syllogism Geisler told us, and remember him teaching us that the Bible is the word of God. God cannot err. Therefore, the Bible cannot err. Right? So if the Bible errs, it must be either some sense not the word of God or some sense God can err. Well, that little syllogism, obviously the question of the Bible is the word of God is largely theological. We see from scripture it's self-proclamation and other things, and we build that argument. But what about the premise that says God cannot err? What are the boundaries of that? I would submit to you that that's a philosophical question. Whether God can error or allow error or whatever, however you're going to work that in, that's going to impact your doctrine of inspiration because that your doctrine of inspiration is going to be inextricably bound up in your theology proper, the nature of God and God's attributes, which are philosophical to some extent. At any rate, that's just a handful that we could probably come up with more.
So this concludes part one of a multi-part Timotheus Academy episode, featuring a recent discussion that took place between myself and a dear friend of mine, Dr. Richard Howe. As you've heard in our discussion, Dr. Howe and I discussed very important matters, including the topics of what is philosophy and what philosophy is able to do. These topics were featured in this part one of this multi-part Timotheus Academy episode. Be sure to be on the lookout for part two of this multi-part Timotheus Academy episode. Please also subscribe to this podcast and check out other Timotheus Academy content as well by going to timotheusacademy.com. As always, I look forward to seeing you again here soon at Timotheus Academy.